Melissa Walls is an associate professor from the Department of International Health and co-director from the Johns Hopkins Center for Indigenous Health from Duluth, Minnesota. She will discuss the significance of culture for well-being, evidence from community and scientific perspectives.
Buju and Denoi Maganadug, Memengwan Anishinaabe, Magizi Duodam. I'm Melissa Walls. I'm Bois, Forte, and Couchiching First Nation Ojibwe on my mom's side. My mom is one of the last in our family to be dual enrolled in a U.S. reservation and a Canadian First Nation, loopholes and treaties. Sometimes that happens. And then on my dad's side, I'm a German, Swedish hot dish sort of mix. And this is my yard. This is the water that I get to be by every day up in northeastern Minnesota on ceded territory of the Fond du Lac Band of Ojibwe. And, you know, it was a long journey for me to get here, a mere less than 2-hour drive, although my car veered off to the right and I landed at IKEA this morning. I had to get a few things. It's the only IKEA in the state, so we have to stop there. And with my dad's Swedish heritage, I go there to get some things now and then. Authentic traditional culture over there at IKEA. Speaking of culture, I'm here today to talk about some research stuff a little bit, but I'm going to use findings from models of research that we do in collaboration with multiple tribal nations in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Ontario, Canada. These are pictures of some of the teammates over the years, and so I'm here representing the voices of our team. I'm just one of actually about 80 of us who work together and have worked together over the past 20 years. And I was trained to do research. I have a PhD in sociology. I now work in public health. And I think research is just a tool. Dr. Redvers said that this morning. You know, it's a tool for knowledge translation. It's a tool to enact change in these modern ways. And it has major, major limitations, and that's what I'm here to talk about. So I think we all know that the plight of colonization has had an impact and continues to have an impact on us. This is a bar chart I frequently show as a public health scholar. This shows us your life expectancy at birth based on the year you were born. So the dark blue bars are 2019, the light blue is if you were born in 2020, and so on. Now, if you look across this bar chart, what you'll see is no matter which sociopolitical, racial, ethnic category identified at the bottom, life expectancy has been going down. And this was major news a year ago because that hasn't happened in the United States in a long, long time. And you can guess some of the causes of this. Dr. Frizzell talked about it this morning in regards to masking. COVID-19 is a big driver of some of these changes between 2019 and 2021. Another big driver of death across the groups is overdose-related deaths. And if you look at American Indians and Alaska Natives, AIAN, on my far right, I don't know, yeah, it probably goes the same way for you. I don't know if you can see the chart. Yes, it's still there. Our life expectancy is way, way lower than everyone else. If an American Indian or Alaska Native person is born in 2021, they can expect to live to see 65 years compared to an Asian person born in that same year might live 83 and a half years. That is not okay. That is 20 years difference. And the causes of that we know. We know it's related to colonization and all of the things that have come with it and the things that we now value in our society. And so the antidote to this across communities, every community I've worked with, every elder I've spoken to, says that culture is the antidote to this situation that we've gotten ourselves into. And I think Dr. Redvers said something very similar this morning. You will hear people say things like, our culture is medicine, our culture is treatment, our culture is healing, our culture is the pathway forward. And it was interesting, it was a person at the National Institute of Health who is non-Native who said to a group of us who were saying things like this once, you know, I hear Native folks say culture is healing all the time, but that word culture means something very specific in Indigenous circles. And you all know what that means. It means something almost pre-colonial or pre-contact. It means those traditional ways, those original instructions, the things Dr. Edwards spoke about this morning. But what does that exactly mean, and how does it translate in this post-colonial context? That is the scientific question that our team grapples with. It is a moral question, it's an ethical question. And so briefly today, I'm going to talk about this because it relates to, I think, almost all of the presentations that we will see. And again, it's through the context and the lens of a research space. So 20 years ago, I was recruited to graduate school. I was a community member from a place that was being studied by researchers at the University of Nebraska. And my uncle, Gary Adams, who rarely texts me, but just happened to text me right before I came on stage, which is interesting. He was, at the time, hired by the university to be like the Indian liaison, or the liaison to the community between the university and our tribe. So he was this go-between. There's certain, people call it different things now, but back then, he was like a scout for them. And it was a very interesting situation, but that's a whole nother talk. At any rate, my Uncle Gary told these investigators, listen, you got to train up some Anishinaabe people to learn how to do these studies. And I was fortunate that they took a chance on me, and I was recruited to graduate school. The story goes at my grandma's house over a bowl of her chili. And so then I went off to graduate school, and what I learned is that the investigators of this study were thinking about, quote unquote, measuring culture in a survey. They wanted to measure cultural ways to see how it related to health outcomes. And they used a three-prong approach that they called enculturation. And they called enculturation this idea that we are embedded or connected to our traditional culture through knowledge, for example, of language or activities, through our identity, for having a positive native identity, or through practices. What are the things that we're doing? Are we doing traditional practices for us, like seasonal rounds? Are we going ricing? Are we collecting berries? Are we collecting medicines? Or do we go to ceremony? Do we participate in powwows? Do we sing at the drum? These were the things that they tried to measure. And it came in part from listening to First Nations elders and elders in Minnesota and Wisconsin who talked about those three dimensions of culture as important to them. So you can see a few examples of those things here. At the same time, the team wanted to measure kind of the stressors related to, I like to call them culturally relevant stressors. So things like discrimination, including in the healthcare settings, in our jobs, in our schools. This measure that our team is known for is called historical loss scale. It's this measure of how frequently do you think about the loss of your cultural ways, the loss of your land, the loss of your language. They tried to measure things like boarding school attendance within families, relocation programs. Adverse childhood experiences were also measured, and other things. And what we know from our studies is, and what you know from common sense, is all of these things are linked to worse health, including the way we eat, the way we think about or relate to the food that we have, the way that we think about the water, the land, the things that Dr. Redver spoke about this morning. All of that disrupts those kind of traditional values, or can disrupt them. It works to try to disrupt them anyway. And a brief aside I want to say to you right now is this thing about adverse childhood experiences, it's linked to all sorts of negative health outcomes, right? So the story goes like this. If I am exposed to stressful or traumatic things as a child, that affects me all the way to my adulthood. It could be through heart disease, it could be through type 2 diabetes, all sorts of health indicators. I just want to say briefly that there's another measure out there called benevolent childhood experiences or positive childhood experiences. This isn't the point of the talk today, but that measure offsets the effects of adverse childhood experiences, and nobody's talking about it. So similar to Dr. Redver's this morning, and we hear other scholars talk about the drama of the trauma, we can move beyond that and measure some of the positives as well. Okay, so, yes. It is good to measure the good things. So let's get back to the good things. So we know all of this to be true, that stress and trauma are bad for us, right? So back to culture. If we know this, how might culture lead to good health, including what I'm going to call food systems related to health? We are at a native nutrition conference. We are thinking about food and our food systems and where our food comes from and how we relate to our food. How does this all connect to culture? So there's one pathway that we can think about, a direct path. Culture leads to better health, better connection to food, better nutrition, all of the things. We can think about indirect pathways. Our culture, however we're thinking about it, can lead to some new thing, which then relates to better health. So, for example, if I'm embedded in my culture, maybe I'm connected to where my food comes from. Maybe I learn that value, and it changes the way that my diet behaviors are, right? I eat in a different way. And then the third thing that we can think about is if we imagine those stressors and traumas that we know impact us, we can actually offset the effect of that stress on our well-being through culture. And there's a model out there called the Indigenous stress coping model. It's one of my favorites because it's very pragmatic, and it's written in part by Indigenous scholar Karina Walters. And it shows us how cultural things can offset those stressors. So just as an example of the offsetting effects, briefly, we won't get into the details on this. We have found, for example, that people who are more connected to their culture are less likely to feel the depressing effects of historical cultural losses. So while the cultural losses still happen to us, the land was taken, the language has been attacked, the effect on our mental health is less extreme as we work to reclaim our connection to our culture. Okay, so it buffers, it offsets that stressful feeling. We also see this in a lot of food-related studies. So our team does a lot of work around diabetes. We see that factors like communal mastery are good for our diabetes empowerment. What this means is I get by with a little help from my friends, right? This notion that through a sense of communalism and a sense that we got this together, I can offset the stressful effects of, even in this case, something very tangible, which is not having enough money for the type of food I'm told I need to eat to be well when I have diabetes. So I'm not going to go through all the details on these, but over and over again, we find that all these different kind of indicators of cultural and communal connectedness seem to be offsetting these stressful effects. And in a nutshell, across a variety of studies, we see that cultural factors are linked to better, just good stuff, right? So for kids, academic success is higher, substance use disorders are improved. For adults, we see better flourishing mental health. We see cessation from alcohol use, stopping alcohol use. So across the board, there's a bunch of studies that have been done now, and these are just some from our team, that demonstrate this culture and health connection. All right, so that could be the end, and I could get off the stage, but the whole point, and this is the plot twist, is actually it doesn't work so perfectly because of the post-colonial predicament we're in. And this is difficult stuff to talk about, but it's knowledge that has been shared, and so I'm going to briefly give you way too many numbers on a screen. But a cautionary tale here. If we look at what's happening on this screen, the story goes like this. In Model 1, if you just looked at Model 1 on this screen, we're doing some analyses with survey data. And the findings that we looked at, we were trying to see how culture related to maybe depression, anxiety, and anger, so mental health and cognitive or emotional health. And what we initially found in Model 1, long story short, is it looked like being engaged in your traditional spiritual activities was linked to worse mental health, the opposite of what we would hypothesize or expect, and the opposite of all of the community wisdom, and the opposite of everything, right? And this looked really bad, right? Like, we work in collaboration with community teams and brought these analyses to elders and community partners, and we said, what is going on? These traditional spiritual activities are linked to worse mental health. But if anybody in the room is an academic or a statistician or runs regression models, you can fast forward to the models on the right. And that's not the story. What I just told you is an erroneous story and incomplete. So when you start to account for things like discrimination and cultural loss, the effects that we saw around spiritual activities were wiped away. In other words, what we were really tapping into with that cultural variable was the fact that people who are embedded in their own culture are also more likely to feel that awful effect of discrimination. We also are more aware of those effects of historical losses. And if you don't account for those, you're telling an incomplete story about our culture. So, yes, the drama of the trauma is exhausting, and yet it is part of the reality. And it's an incomplete story if we don't look at all of the pieces that make up communities. And the reason that this model became important to the work of our team is in the explanations. I don't know what's showing up for you, but okay, there we are. So we thought hard about this notion of culture. And we looked at other studies, and we realized that across the published literature, there's a lot of studies out there that actually find either null effects, meaning no association between culture and health in the research world, or find negative effects, like I just showed you, where it looks like some cultural engagement is linked to a worse health outcome, which we know is not true. Community wisdom has it right. Science is lagging behind community wisdom is the story. So what's going on there? So again, back to the post-colonial predicament or the post-colonial complexities. So first and foremost, we know that the historical assaults of colonization, they affect how culture is expressed today. They affect the way that we tap into our own cultural ways. And the example that I'll share with you was given to me from an elder in Red Lake who's no longer on earth with us, but is certainly around, and Murphy Thomas. And many of you who are from Minnesota would know Murphy. And Murphy said, listen, we're measuring indicators of traditional hunting, meaning going out and hunting and maybe sharing it with the community. But what you're not measuring is the spiritual connection to that hunt. Is the ceremony that goes with that hunt happening? Is the prayer or the offering for the life you took being done before the hunt happens? If we're not tapping into all of that with our measures, we're just picking up on something else. It could be, if you all are from Minnesota, people go hunting all the time and don't have any spiritual connection to that hunt. I'm not talking just about Indigenous peoples. This is all across the state. And so what Murphy said is, without really drilling deeper into the way that you're measuring culture and thinking about the values and the activities that are much deeper than just the act of the hunt, you're missing the point, right? And so it's hard, it's difficult to measure. The other thing is humans are multicultural, especially in this post-colonial complex world. I introduced myself as an Anishinaabe, Swedish, German person. What the heck does that even mean? And you know, I think the joke in Native communities often is we're all having identity crises all the time, and it's because of colonization, and who are we, and what am I? It's not therapy session time for me, but it's true. We have multiple identities in this modern world, and so how do we tap into that and assess for that? Also, culture is multidimensional. I've already given you 100 examples blabbing up here. Dr. Redvers gave you a ton as well. You're going to hear more throughout the days and in Tara's talk after me. Culture can mean all sorts of things, and I'm going to show you some examples of how we tried to expand that shortly. There's also a diversity of opinion in our communities about what traditional culture is and is not, and what is accepted and what is not. So I'm sharing a couple of quotes here. One is from a man that I spoke to, a First Nations man, who said, "What I believe, our people come from a thing called Turtle Island. Christianity came from, I don't know, but that's where their roots are. So when our people says they're a Christian, that's like a plant or a tree without roots." He said this, and a woman across the table in a conversation said, well, you know, 6 or 7 years after I got my life straight, I became a Christian. And that's when you all come out and tell me I've gone the wrong way. But to me, I found a way, and it worked for me. And it wasn't until I became a Christian that I found love. Now, I'm not here to tell you which of those is correct, but I also know that at the same time this conversation happened, a young man spoke up and said, well, what I've been taught is the way of the pipe is respect. And that's what I carry with me to try to understand and grapple with this post-colonial complexity, or as Joe Gong calls it, the predicament. And so this relates to what I'm going to kind of close us out on, which is, what is the state of the science now for trying to assess culture? And what does it mean for our collective movement to reclaim our cultures, to revitalize our cultures, to fund programming in this modern world that is supported by our cultures and our values, and to do the things like Dr. Redvers talked about, right? Like she said, she didn't need to prove the anti-inflammatory properties of chokeberries, but it was a practical step towards getting some policy change to happen, right? So what is the state of the science right now? Well, ask me in a few years, but I'll tell you about that in a second. Here's what I do know. This three-pronged approach to assessing culture was and is inadequate. Science will always be inadequate to measure culture. It's never going to get there fully, but we can do better. So we can expand to think about values, about kinship, about other things that you see on your screen. We can also assess our strengths. That is culture. That's an expansion of the measures. And so for our team, as we've started to expand what we call Indigenous culture, we find things like this. So at the bottom of the screen, you should see a bunch of words that we use as indicators of sociocultural connection. Measures like giving and receiving social support. Again, getting by with a little help from our friends, having a positive Anishinaabe identity, feeling social connectedness with our communities, and an assessment of awareness of connectedness of all things. There's measures of this from Alaska, right? When we measure those things, what we find is people report at the highest levels of all of these, of course, they report the highest physical health, the highest mental health, and the greatest spiritual health compared to others. But the whole, the bits, are more than the sum of the parts, right? So the whole becomes something bigger with all of these assessments of culture included. You have to measure all of it, is one of the stories about the state of the science. It's complex, and you have to measure multiple dimensions. Another story is we have to get a little more creative in the way we're assessing culture. And so the measure that I'm going to share with you here is called cultural efficacy. I'm going to go back to my idea about that slide where I showed you the debate that happened at the table between the person who identified as a Christian and the person who identified as traditional. I was at a community event, and one of my collaborators from that community, who is someone I've worked with for 20 years now, we were meeting with elders, and I said to her, I brought some kinnikinnick, actually, traditional tobacco. And so do you want to offer to the elders? Is it better if I do as the guest? And she looked appalled. She said, I don't know how to offer them tobacco. And she looked so ashamed. And I have felt that shame over and over again. And that look struck me so deeply and stuck with me for so long, and sticks with me every time I feel ashamed for not knowing how to speak my language or how to approach a certain ceremony. And so working with a team member named Migas Gonzalez, who is a role model for all of us. She went and got her PhD in the Western world and then took similar equivalent years off from academe to immerse herself in our cultural ways. She came back to academia now and helped us to come up with this measure of cultural efficacy. What we're trying to tap into is the opposite of that fear and that shame and that angst. The feeling like, I know who to ask help from to learn how to do it the way that we're supposed to do it. Or when I'm in a cultural setting, I don't feel ashamed, I feel comfortable. Or I feel okay speaking my language even if I'm not doing it quite right. You know, all of these kinds of feelings like, yeah, I feel safe to try. And what we found is that measure of cultural efficacy, kind of the opposite of cultural anxiety or cultural shame, is actually a major mediator in the connection between culture and good outcomes across the board. So what this tells us is, in all of our collective work to reclaim culture, it's not enough to just give a person an opportunity or, hold a powwow or hold a cultural event. It's creating the energy, the open hearts, the open sharing in that room and in that space, and finding elders and finding teachers who will allow us to make some mistakes and not make us feel so ashamed that we never come back. And that is hard. It's hard to do because we're all on a healing journey, but what we found is that this measure actually works really well. So I think that's really important. So the state of the science then is we need to continue to innovate in these measures of what we call culture, because I think it's really interesting, and what it's doing for me at least is guiding me on an introspective journey of what does it mean to even me, right? As I said, we know that science is behind. I believe science will never catch up to community wisdom to know that culture is the pathway to getting us out of this mess of life expectancy and all of the problems that ail us. What we're finding, though, is the state of the science, frankly, is kind of a mess. And so I'm just going to show you a work in progress that I don't expect anybody to enjoy. This is those jam boards. And my colleague Melissa Lewis is here. She is leading up a systematic review of every single measure of culture ever published in the academic literature in the past 10 years. I don't know, Melissa, we have like 5,500 articles left to screen. It's really going well. And so there's about 8 of us working on this paper. And this jam board basically shows you across the top kind of the domains of culture people are measuring. So if we just looked at cultural identity, people are calling it all sorts of things in the literature, right? They're like calling it just cultural or just racial identity, or they call it pride or affinity. But when you look at like the survey measures or the things they're actually asking people, it's almost the same thing, but they're calling it something totally different. And it's just across the board, and guilty as charged, this one on the stage, right? Like it's an infancy. It's a science in its infancy. And so we're working to try to assess the current literature and then provide some insights on a path forward. Maybe we could have some shared terminology and kind of, get on some same pages. And you'll see under food, it's hard to read, but people are measuring connection to food. They're measuring eating traditional foods. They're measuring things like food as medicine, but that also overlaps with spirituality. And so it's very complicated, and no wonder it's so hard, and no wonder the state of the science is a mess. But even with that said, we're getting somewhere. We're making policy changes. Right now, at the federal level, there is widespread discussion and movement to move forward with traditional healing as a billable practice, for better or for worse, right? At the federal level, we know that traditional ecological knowledge is now called for by the White House, the Biden White House, that should be consulted in all federal policy. And so things are happening. And so I'll leave it at this. I think this is fitting. Dr. Redvers ended with a quote from her sister. I'm ending with one from my cousin, Dean, up in Canada. And these are 2 pictures. One is my grandpa, Peter Adams, at the top, holding my cousin, Jessica. And he's a boarding school survivor. His wife is in the bottom picture, my grandma Florence, and she did not go to a residential school. Her family moved a block off of the reserve so that the kids didn't end up in St. Margaret's. And what my cousin Dean, who descends from the black and white picture side, said is because of that move to save their children from the residential school, they lost our culture. We lost our identity, our home, our close kinship to our people, but survived. And we are here, and we remain and flourish as we journey to become who we were always. Be proud, be active, be loud, be kind, gentle, and walk a good path. Our ancestors are among us and guiding us as we return to that circle one by one. And so the state of the science is a mess, but the state of us is this, right? We're coming back, and we know it can be simpler. And then finally, I'll close with a plug. This is a shameless plug, but I've got my colleague Shane outside at a blue table. So if anybody is interested in fully funded Masters in Public Health or DRPH programs at Johns Hopkins, please talk to Shane. He's here to recruit future Indigenous scholars. And I'll say I work for Johns Hopkins University, but I live in Minnesota, and the reason I moved institutions is because I believe all of these institutions owe us. And so let's fill up the fellowship program with all of these Native brilliant people, and let's get her done, as they say. So miigwech.